So what Chris and I are going to do, keeping you guys on schedule, but also trying to get into the weeds a little bit about what happened last session, a little bit of a preview of what's going on this next session. We'll jump right in. So I always say when you look at a session overview, it's good to just look at the stats in general. So that red bar at the top, that's the total number of bills filed, 3,500. And then in the next bar, you see the Senate bills on the left and then the House bills on the right. That totals about, that's what those are. And then the next chart down, it's the type. Those appropriation bills are on that left part of the bar, and then general bills, which think policy, 1,600. And then as you see, that little green line is what actually passed through both chambers at the end of the day. That's 197. So if you think 35, there are almost 3,600 bills, less than 200 passed, and a few of those were vetoed by the governor. It is not easy to get legislation passed, and it's even harder than the old days. When Chris or I or Rob, whoever was given this talk 4 years ago, there's a mandatory process that was a little more liberal as how you went and got amendments through in the House and Senate. That is no longer the case. You could still get amendments through, but back in the day they used to put a lot of trains together and a lot of amendments would fly on the last 2 weeks of session. They've become a lot more strict about that process the last couple of years. So that 197 is a more true 197 than it might have been 4 or 5 years ago. You know what, before I forget, you might have already met her. With us today is also Kim McDougal, who is on our team out of Tallahassee office, former Chief of Staff to Governor Scott, and General Rockstar on the Gray Robinson team out of Tallahassee. So I want to give her a shout out here. She could give this all on her own. It requires two of us to give the presentation from our side. So as you know, there were elections back in 2018. There were some recounts. We'll go into that. But with elections bring new leaders, and we have three essential new leaders for our process. You have the governor, you have the president of the Senate, Bill Galvano, and the Speaker of the House, Jose Oliva. And with them come priorities. Governor Ron DeSantis, some of these are pretty well known if you were following just front page headlines. Water quality, which he put his stamp on. Government accountability, deregulation, he's still doing some of that this session. Coming up, appointments to the bench, he had 3 to the Supreme Court in his first month in office. I guess he picked them really well because 2 of those have already been selected by President Trump to go on the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals on the federal side, which is essentially one step down from the U.S. Supreme Court. So before they've even served a year on the bench for Florida, they're probably going to get confirmed by the Senate before the election, and the governor will have 2 more appointments, probably before sometime.
All right. Thank you, Chris. And I'm Chris Dawson with the team. Thank you all for having us. And I'll jump in right on that. As Chris mentioned, there's one constitutionally required bill every session, and that is the state budget. As you can imagine, there are a lot of competing priorities in Florida, and though we've had many years of growth in the state, we've also had growth in areas of need, healthcare, corrections. And so this is a breakdown of the budget we had this year. As Senator Harrell mentioned, it was the largest budget in state history at $91.1 billion. You can see a big chunk of that. The largest chunk, about 43%, is the healthcare budget. That's quickly followed by the education budget at $22.5 billion. And then we'll recall we had a few things special this year. Of course, hurricane recovery up in the Panhandle, that was about $250 million. And then the renewed focus on agriculture and natural resources funding that she mentioned, and we'll go into that in greater detail. So looking ahead for the budget in particular, questions arise. As I mentioned, we've had many years of recurring growth. This year, economists are starting to question, are we nearing a slowdown? Certainly, the Revenue Estimating Conference within the legislature thinks that we are getting into a period where there may be an economic slowdown. We're projecting a very small $200 million surplus this year. That number may be refined down when the EDR meets in January. Nonetheless, we have to start planning for this slowdown and potentially budget deficits to come in some of the out years. Another big question this year that's going to be coming back, and we're going to discuss this in detail, is Visit Florida funding. You likely recall the sort of public fight that took place over this during the last session, and big questions on whether or not Visit Florida should even exist. So we'll go into that topic. And then finally, internet sales tax. This is a collection function for states to capture internet sales tax for transactions going on. This issue's been around for a little while, but there was a Supreme Court decision last year that gave states many more arrows in the quiver, if you will, for capturing internet sales tax proceeds. And so there's a question as to whether or not the state's going to take advantage of some of those opportunities now afforded to it. So issues that dominated in any session, there are a tremendous number of issues going on. Healthcare, corrections, education, workforce training, all of these issues. We're going to jump into these and take a few of them topic by topic, but this is just to give you an idea of all of the things swirling around during a legislative session.
So one, real quickly, property development. This bill got a little controversial at the end of session, whether the governor was going to sign it. What it does, a couple different things. You've heard a lot about affordable housing and workforce housing. The problem is, if you're in that industry, you know that inclusionary zoning, some of those things that local governments want to look to make this work, offsets generally the cost of this project, meaning it changes your pro forma and makes it more expensive. So this law would say that if local government does that, they have to fully offset the costs for that, which essentially is saying the developer's not going to have their project double in cost now that because they're requiring affordable housing. It establishes shot clocks for permitting. So if any of you are in areas where they've got development orders and such, one of the bigger issues is if you're trying to get that through is you apply to a local government and you don't get results on your application for months, even though you're working with staff trying to get it going. This now requires 30 days to get some feedback, and then after that you as an applicant have time, a shot clock on you to give feedback back to the city, and then they have 120 or 180 days based on whether it's quasi-judicial or not on the approval. What's interesting on this is, so this came out of Pinellas County, is if you get a development order approved and someone's development order, think an environmentalist that has problems with that project, the loser has to pay the attorney's fees. Now that was not always the case, but what would happen is whether it's Orange County, Pinellas, Duval, what have you across the state, some developer would go through a long, arduous process to go get this development order approved, work with staff, whoever that may be, liberal or conservative, to get it done. And then the minute it's approved, someone locally sues it, usually a NIMBY that says, I don't want this in my backyard. Slows up the process 2 or 3 years before it's finally settled out in the courts, and usually, almost always the developer wins because these things have gone through a long, arduous process already, but now they're out of their attorney's fees. This now says loser pays. Now, shockingly, not really, that was controversial. Environmentalists will say this will discourage any kind of lawsuits challenging these projects if they have environmental sensitive areas or what have you. And there's already a bill this year to try and carve that part out because it was approved by the governor. I don't know if that's going to pass, but that's something certainly to pay attention to. And there's a lot of other stuff in this bill. It was about 78 pages long, dealing with impact fees or whatever, but it's generally considered a positive for the development community, but like with every piece of legislation, there's compromises. Election law changes. Did you hear we had some recounts in Florida in 2018? Just a couple. Actually, proudly, our firm ended up representing Senator Scott and his then governor, but now Senator Rick Scott and his recount. We had at some point, I think, 67 attorneys across the state engaged on this issue, which was kind of exciting. His was probably the most interesting because it was for the Senate, but we had 3. We had one for the governor, we had one for the Ag Commissioner, and we had one for the U.S. Senate race. Interestingly enough, in the Ag Commission race, Nikki Fried, who's now the commissioner, to bed that night. She went to bed thinking she lost that race, and by the time she woke up, Broward County had her up by about 2,000 or 3,000 votes, and by the end of the day, it was more like 5,000, 6,000 votes. So thank you, Broward County. If anyone's from there, they keep it interesting. But they changed a lot of the laws because, surprisingly, a 2-page elections department has put out for years somehow had 67 different interpretations, believe it or not, of what you could do during a recount. So some of the major highlights is they moved the actual primary elections up a week. So instead of 10 weeks before the general, it's 11. They expanded the no solicitation zone. So if you vote in person, if you're old-fashioned like me and you still do that, you've probably seen the cones they put up. That used to be 100 that said no solicitation. That meant no one's going to ask you for your vote in that area. If you vote on a church or something, you don't see anyone because usually churches and any solicitation. What's interesting now, though, is it's pushed to 150 feet, but the new rule says that you cannot restrict any solicitation beyond that. So whether it's on a church or a library, now if 51 feet out, you will get accosted for, I promise you, whether it's in the presidential preference this coming March, or if you have some local city elections coming up, or next November or August 2020, they're going to come find you and ask for your vote. And then changes to canvassing. So a fun anecdote story from the recount. We had some supervisors that would take damaged ballots, which under the law, ballot, you're supposed to repair it. So you'd look at how the votes were marked on there, and you remark it, and then you put it through the machine. Some supervisors thought that you didn't have to do that with anyone else around. They would just in their office take the 14 damaged ballots, remark it how they thought appropriate, and then they put it in the machines. This law makes it absolutely clear you have to do that in front of party representatives, in front of the canvassing board, what have you. Seems logical, but maybe not always. Always fun in Florida. All right.
Okay, Hurricane Michael, today actually is the 1-year anniversary of Hurricane Michael making landfall up in the Panhandle. And as we all know, it was such a devastating storm. Since we've learned, of course, that it was a Category 5, the strongest to hit the state and the U.S. since Andrew. But the impact on Michael is still to be felt and will be through the next several budget cycles, I think. But in the 2019 session, the legislature felt the need to act and did. If you'll recall, it took 6 months for Congress to put forward a federal relief package. So the state, meeting before Congress got their act together, decided to send some help up to the Panhandle. So just a little breakdown of what was done. $1.6 billion was the actual state's cost in responding to the storm. That's things like emergency operations center costs, cutting trees to get into Panama City and Gulf counties and all those things. So the state itself incurred a $1.6 billion expenditure. And then the legislature put into the budget some relief funds for those affected areas. So about $220 million total, $115 million of that in affordable housing alone. And then you can see several grant programs were also created. The last thing that I'll mention on Hurricane Michael, and now that we've had, of course, that devastating storm and the scare of Dorian this year, so we're sort of out of the lull that we had for 10 years of no storms, no threats. So a significant commitment was made to really beef up the Division of Emergency Management, giving them the opportunity to have 20 full-time employees added to their roster, just accepting the fact that this is Florida and hurricanes are a reality. Healthcare reform, I'm going to breeze through this one because Senator Harrell covered it in detail, but she mentioned the Certificate of Need repeal and the staged implementation for that. Of course, she also described the 2 prescription drug programs. Those have been sent to D.C. for approval, and the administration in D.C. has been acting with the state to try to get those advanced. And then finally, one that maybe wasn't touched on as much, but a continuation of the telehealth revolution, if you will, in healthcare. Of course, telehealth has been around for a couple years now as an option to more cheaply provide healthcare and to have greater availability. This bill continued in the practice of deregulating that industry, and it now allows for the use of out-of-state physicians for telehealth.
So I'm going to breeze through this one too, and I'm going to say if you have any real questions, ask Kim, because this is like presenting in front of your professor. She knows school safety and school choice better than any of us. But when it comes to that, on the Guardian program on school safety, one thing to note is, if you recall, last year was non-instructional personnel would participate in the Guardian program, which is a result of the Parkland incident. This is now for instructional personnel as well, could participate in the Guardian program and be armed on campus. So allows charter schools to participate in this, requires the school boards to promote Fortify Florida, including installing it on all the devices issued to students. It enhances powers and authority for the Office of Safe Schools and the DOE, and then allocates 1/3 of the Safe Schools funding based on the most recent FDLE Florida Crime Index. That was a long bill, so I did that quickly. And then school choice, no surprise here, especially on the House. Speaker Oliva and Speaker Corcoran before him, a major priority was expanding school choice options. This is and this was a governor's priority as well, so no surprise they pushed for this as well. Expands eligible contributors to Florida Tax Credit Scholarship, Gardner Scholarship, Hope Scholarship programs. Expands the Schools of Hope program, which was for students who had been bullied. And then Florida Empowerment Scholarship for up to 18,000 children. And then it restructures Best and Brightest to move it from the, if you recall, I don't remember which year it was, but a while ago they set up Best and Brightest, which gave bonuses to teachers based on their ACT or SAT score. Now, my brother, who's a teacher who did very well in high school, this was to his benefit. Congratulations, Robert, my brother. But he used to joke, well, should it really matter? One test I took when I was a junior in high school. No, of course not. They've switched it now to effective and highly effective ratings, which is a much better indicator of how teachers are doing and educating our students. Good news for my brother, if you're wondering, he's highly effective, so he got that bonus. But as you've probably seen from the headlines, there's already legislation to just completely repeal this program altogether. Since its inception, it's been highly controversial within the schools because they don't think it's a fairly way to do bonuses and allocations and not. And as well, you probably saw the governor, he's already put out, he wants the legislature to put $600 million towards new teacher, and I think it's first couple years of teaching for base salary increases for teachers, and then he's hinted that there'll be others coming for more senior teachers. So clearly this governor is focused on that. I'm not totally confident on that $600 million. The Speaker of the House, he had a press release that if it could have been like iceberg cold water pouring on that program, he did in his tweet saying, well, it's a good thing we have a balanced budget process, which was his signal saying, fine, we'll fund this, but something else is going to lose. So we'll have to figure that out. But it's encouraging to see what they're doing with our schools and teachers there. Economic development.
All right. Well, continuing on for economic development, of course, the state function really is broken down into two agencies. We have Enterprise Florida, which is the public-private partnership aimed at statewide economic development. You may recall from a couple sessions ago, they got beat up a little bit with the legislature, but since Enterprise Florida has been fully funded for their operations and has been leading trade missions, you likely saw the one that the governor and Enterprise Florida took to Israel. I think more recently he took a domestic trade trip to Chicago, and so really continuing the mantra of jobs, 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 and trying to get more business and investment brought to the Sunshine State. The second one, and I touched on this a little bit earlier, Visit Florida. I guess it's sort of their turn to be the punching bag in Tallahassee. This is the state's tourism marketing organization. Of course, you've probably seen some of the ads that they do trying to get folks to come down to Florida beaches. I think the funniest one I've seen was a heated bus stop in New York City during the winter saying, come down to Fort Lauderdale Beach, it's 80-something degrees. Pretty smart. But that organization is up for its renewal by the legislature. It's a creature of statute, so every few years it has to be renewed. They were up in 2019 for a renewal. The legislature really got into a philosophical conversation about whether or not Visit Florida should exist. Is it the state's responsibility to market tourism? And so rather than ultimately decide that issue, they kind of punted. So Visit Florida was renewed for 1 year. Their budget was cut from $76 million to $50 million, and now we know that that conversation will be taking place this coming legislative session. A bill has already been filed for the 2020 session that would extend Visit Florida for another 8 years, and so that's a conversation that's going to be ongoing. Finally, the Florida Job Growth Grant Fund. This was something that was created under Governor Rick Scott to help local governments and workforce development agencies draw investment and infrastructure in their communities, thereby bringing jobs. This was funded at $40 million this past year, and Governor DeSantis has, I believe, taken a liking to this program. They're actually going to be requesting a little bit of additional dollars for the 2020 session, so it looks like the Job Growth Grant Fund will be around for a little while longer.
Now pay attention to this one. We spent a lot of money in our graphics department for this one, okay?
Color-coded for your convenience. So Carmody mentioned at the top of the presentation priorities. Well, this toll road and transportation corridor project really was a top priority for Senate President Galvano. And so you'll see this did pass as part of a transportation package. And what it does is it creates 3 new tolled transportation corridors in the state. So we'll start with the smallest, an extension of the Florida Turnpike from Wildwood to the Suncoast Parkway. The second, the yellow shaded area, would be an extension of the Suncoast Parkway all the way up to the Georgia line. And the third, which this project's been around for a little while, it would come from Polk County and head down into the Fort Myers area. Some have called it the Heartland Expressway, but the Polk-Collier corridor. And those 3 are all currently set, I believe, to start construction within the next 3 years. So the funding has already begun to be set aside. There's a mechanism in the bill that will continue funding that through the completion of all 3 of these projects. I think a small question that's going to pop up is some of that funding is based on gas tax revenues, which we all know have been in decline as fuel efficiency goes up. So there may be some questions on funding as the program gets into the latter years, but this was a top priority and it did pass.
So you probably heard about this. This was certainly front page news as well. Campaign issue, sanctuary city ban. So the good news is there are no sanctuary cities in Florida, and before this legislation, but this legislation makes clear that there has to be compliance with federal ICE if you have any issues in your community. Truthfully, this is probably an issue in search of a solution, but the solution is here and it'll be fine. Florida doesn't have some of the issues that other states have where they're considered to be sanctuary cities and such, but now you know you're safe, I guess. So there you go. Voting rights restoration. This also very controversial. So you probably all remember Amendment 4. It was number 4 of your 28 amendments. There was only actually 13, but it felt like there's 28. All right. So, this one dealt with restoration of voting rights for felony convicts. So here's what the issue was. Everyone said self-executing. You vote and then you're good. Problem is in the actual language it said created exceptions to getting your rights restored for murder, and as you can see up there, felony, sexual offense. Well, here's the issue. Neither one of those terms are defined in Constitution or statute. So what does that mean? Now, murder, pretty obvious what that means, although there was some philosophical debates. Does that mean attempted murder? Does that mean manslaughter? Does that mean, where do you draw down the line? I mean, you wanted to kill someone, you just weren't good at it. So Should we give you? Thank you for the laugh. Thank you. Okay. And then felony sexual offense as well. This is not defined anywhere in statute. That one's a little trickier, like because there's some gray areas in those particular laws that get controversial, but they worked out most of that. What really got the bright lights of the federal coverage from news and what have you was the payment of fines. And fees. Now, if you had restitution, that's one thing. You burn down someone's house, it's worth $300,000. You have to pay that back. Everyone gets that. No one questions that. But it's your fines and fees from the court, and which also have interest payments while you're serving in jail or a prison or what have you. That became incredibly controversial. The sponsors of both the House and Senate legislation were put under a microscope. Ultimately, what they ended up doing was saying that you did have to pay those because the people who were pushing the constitutional amendment in their Supreme Court review of the language said numerous times when being examined by the Supreme Court that yes, that would include fees and fines imposed by the court. What can happen now, and it'll be played for some interesting politics and some venue shopping, is the courts can waive those fees or set up payment plans or what have you, which will give you a certification to go to your supervisor of elections, say, I'm good to go, I want to get signed up. Well, here's what will happen. Will there be some venue shopping if you find out that the judges in this jurisdiction are going to be a little more in on this than others? Yeah, absolutely. And make no mistake, not to get into those politics, there are conservative and liberal judges. The conservative judges are probably going to be less inclined to waive these fines and fees. The liberal judges are going to be more inclined. That's just life. That's how it works. So this will make for some politics when this starts coming down the line. Because, oh, by the way, did I mention we had 3 recounts last cycle? And there's that little presidential thing coming up in November that I can promise you now there'll be a recount. Hopefully we'll be hired by someone on that recount side and make a lot of money. So pay attention to this. The other side of this, criminal justice reform. Probably the first time in about 20 years, the House and Senate had significant criminal reform. This also goes to the whole smart justice movement, this idea that locking them away and throw away the key is not the solution to the state's problems. In fact, it probably costs us more money. And if you're not investing in these inmates, they recidivate almost immediately, which creates more problems to the state. So a couple of highlights on this. Changed the felony theft threshold from $300 to $750. If you heard grand theft, it hadn't been changed since 1983. There's been just a slight bit of cost inflation since then. Alternative sanctions for technical parole violations. Again, that's another thing. A lot of folks were just going to jail for violating parole, which didn't necessarily make a lot of sense if you're trying to get people, employed and back out there. Changed the way occupational licensing reform, and then with DBPR, timeline for victim compensation funds from 1 to 3 years. And then another thing that we worked on, make cellular phones illegal contraband in a county detention facility. You'd think that was commonplace, but it wasn't. And a lot of bad stuff happened when someone would get a hold of a cell phone. So we said, let's get rid of that.
All right, autonomous vehicles. Well, as we all know, the future is here, and cars do drive themselves. Florida has really staked out a position to be one of the most AV-friendly states. That began a couple sessions ago and certainly continued this year. There was an omnibus AV bill that basically directed state agencies in particular to begin implementing contracts, services, infrastructure to facilitate autonomous vehicle technology. If you travel the turnpike, if you travel on any of the interstates, you're going to start seeing charging stations. You're going to start seeing pilot programs on these autonomous vehicles. So don't be too shocked one day in the not so distant future when you look next to you and the car doesn't have a driver. That's just the way we're headed. It provides for statewide uniformity of laws governing AV. So if you do hop in your Tesla in Orlando and you want to drive down to Key West, you don't have to worry, does the law change? Do I have to take over and drive through this county or that city? There will be uniformity. Additionally, micro-mobility has become an issue. Of course, Uber and Lyft, I think, kind of were the tip of the spear. And now, if you've been to any of the big cities around the state, you've probably seen bikes. You've probably seen scooters in other parts of the country. And so the micro-mobility bill is really aimed at implementing some of those technologies. And really, it is the scooter bill. So, your Lime scooters or there's a host of brands. But it basically gives them the same parity as a bicycle rider. So they can share in those bicycle lanes. They're governed by the same laws. It does allow local governments to regulate the placement of the scooters on streets, highways, sidewalks, anything within their jurisdiction so that people can't just dump them and the city has no recourse. And finally, I think a good thing for all of us in Florida, it does require these companies to have a plan for getting their scooters off the street in case we have a hurricane. Workforce education and training, a major effort that went through the legislative session this year, House Bill 7071, probably the largest workforce initiative that's going on in maybe better than a decade. You'll recall during the campaign, this was a big promise from Governor DeSantis to start focusing on workforce education, really to make a career readiness pathway just as available to all students in Florida as a college readiness pathway. And so the bill goes a long way in doing that. First, and importantly, it directs the Department of Education to start collecting data on apprenticeship and pre-apprenticeship programming. The desire for this is really to make sure that we're educating students that want to go into the workforce, that we're giving them the skills and tools needed to go into careers that are in demand. So this will track what type of apprentices are being trained, how they're being placed, and things of that nature. It renames a couple of councils that have previously looked at these issues and consolidates them all into the Florida Talent Development Council. This is a group made up of government folk and private industry folk, again, looking at where are the most needs in the state and in the workforce and where can we get students placed most quickly. This council actually met for the first time last week. It creates the Career and Technical Education Graduation Pathway, which is a mouthful, but basically that is the career track for all high school students. So every district will have to come up with a plan to allow for students to go on a career readiness track versus, really kind of being left to either college or bust. A couple other little small policy tweaks. One significant goal for the state is the Sail to 60 initiative, and this is basically the state's goal of having 60% of Florida residents, working age adults with a high-value post-secondary certificate, degree, or experience by 2030. So pushing Florida to have a 60% trained, employed workforce by 2030 in these targeted fields.
So I know you heard about this one because none of you text and drive, I'm certain. But if you were thinking about it, don't. It's now primary offense. So the police officers, sheriffs, deputies, and what have you can now pull you over if they think you're texting. And actually, as of October 1, they're going to do a warning period on that from October 1 to hopefully you get the ones that are giving out warnings as opposed to tickets if that's you. There's going to be a statewide public education and awareness campaign, so you'll see TV ads, billboards, and if you go to sporting events or what have you see stuff there. And in the school or work zone, which is interesting, it's a complete hands-free zone. So you can't even have your phone like this. It's no texting, no phone. Now, if you have those Bluetooth devices or Apple Play or Android Play or whatever that is in your car, that's fine. But hands-free zone, so no phone in your hand, period, on those. And then some interesting nuances on the law. It requires law enforcement to inform the driver that they cannot take your phone without your permission. So if you get busted for one of these, hopefully not, that you actually can keep your phone. They have no right to take your phone to confirm whether you were texting or not. You can say, nope, I'm gonna keep my phone. So they have to tell you that, so hopefully they do. It requires a warrant to access the device. And then one of the reasons this bill did not pass, it's been around for several years, was there was a concern of profiling, specifically racial profiling of, well, officers will just go in the neighborhoods where they want to go make arrests for whatever reason, and they'll just, because we all kind of have our phones in our hands even if we're not texting, right? If you're calling or navigation or what have you, you could probably arrest anyone out there on that road right now if you really wanted to for texting, because everyone's always got a phone in their hand, or pull them over. So it requires, if you issue a ticket, you actually have to record the race of the person on the ticket. And there will be a study done at the end of this fiscal year to determine was this actually being enforced through any kind of profiling mechanism, or is it generally across the board? And they are out. This morning I was taking my son to preschool and we drove through 2 school zones. We saw officers pulling folks over, which I'm no doubt for texting, and my son said, well, that boy probably wasn't wearing his car seat, right, Dad? Because we've told him it's illegal not to wear the car seat. That's the only way to get him in that car seat. So they are out. Be careful if you're out in the morning or in the school zones out there. That's texting while driving. Okay. He really does think that, so don't tell him otherwise. We need him to sit in that seat. All right, a couple issues that failed, but they will absolutely be back this 2020 session. Alcohol freedom issues. If you're at all familiar with the 3-tier system, the Tide House laws and everything in Florida when it comes to alcohol and liquor distribution, it is severely antiquated. It makes prohibition be a joke. Can you tell which side we're on? But where you can't even sell the spirits you make in your own shop without certain license or whatever. So continue to try to fight for your freedom to have alcohol whenever you want it. Deregulation, the governor had a big bill. It got TP'd last year. It kind of got controversial on various things. And that's what it sounded like, deregulating a number of different professions, changing the Florida Building Commission, for example, deregulating how a barber gets his or her license, and down the line. Preemption of local regulations, that was a controversial bill. If the House is in session, you can have no doubt they're going to file something that goes after local governments. That's sort of their MO. But that bill failed. HB decree, but it was going to cut back on a lot of local home rule regulations. Gaming compact. This was the first year that there was no Seminole gaming money. So if you've been to the place, the casino in Tampa or in Hollywood, the one in Tampa is actually the number 2 most profitable casino in the world, not nation, world. Those old ladies in their oxygen machine, they love the slot machine. My second laugh for the day. I'm done, I promise. Okay, so but seriously, it is that profitable. But as you may have read in the papers, the pari-mutuels across the state were now offering blackjack, which was reserved in the compact for the Seminoles. They were looking for basically some loopholes in the law, and they thought they had got away with it. The courts actually said no, they weren't allowed, and that the state was violating the compact of exclusivity to the Seminoles. But the state has yet to do anything to really enforce that. And so the Seminoles have said for a couple years, we're going to put the money, give it to you in good faith for the state to spend. It's about $300 million in revenue each year to the state, but we're eventually going to stop. Well, this year they said they're going to stop. So they still have a compact. They're going to continue to operate blackjack and other things, and they're just going to keep the money. They've said they're going to put it in escrow, and if the state can ever get it done. But so as a result, to some extent, the governor are highly motivated to get this compact fixed because they want that revenue flowing back into the state. The problem in many ways is the House, and I don't mean it as a problem, but the House has just generally said if it's a net neutral or net retraction of gaming, they're all for any kind of gaming compact and gaming legislation. Problem is when you try to do this, it always ends up being a positive because you can't take away from the pari-mutuels, they lobbied up. You can't take away from the Seminoles, they're lobbied up. You can't take away from most anyone else to create a negative gaming unless you got rid of the lottery, which would be controversial because of all the scholarships. So how they get to a net neutral or net negative, I don't know, because the only way the Seminoles are going to cut the deal is if they could get other games that they can add to the table, which would be a net positive. And then, oh, by the way, there was all the sports leagues lobbied up to get gambling or sports betting added to the agenda there. So it's a highly controversial issue. It'll be back next session. I'm not confident it'll get done, but they got a lot done this last session, so maybe this one will actually get on the table. Quickly, scope of practice. Senator but that was one of the Speaker Olivo priorities that didn't make it to the finish line of giving nurses expanded scope of practice and providing health care that they believe that will help drive down costs. License plates for the last 8 years, they've had a license plate bill, and that license plate bill has failed. Think of any specialty license plates you could think of. We actually did the research. Our team was part of the last license plate bill that passed. If you have a butterfly on your license tag, you're welcome. That was through UF's Nature Conservancy. We got that done for you. You're welcome. In God We Trust, we also did that one for you in case you like that. But the smoking age increase, there was discussion to make it go up to 21. Looks like Big Tobacco still has good lobbyists because that failed. At fracking ban, they tried to put a fracking ban in place. That again is another bill that's come every year. They might get it done this next year, but I'm not very bullish on that. School board term limits, this was something that was discussed during the Constitutional Revision Commission, but because of the way the wording of it was paired with another issue, it was struck from the ballot by the Florida Supreme Court. But this is now back talking about actually having term limits for school board members. And then Constitutional Revision Commission elimination altogether. That would actually have to go on the ballot, but there's discussion of they wonder whether we need that every 20-year creature of the Constitutional Revision Commission. There's another piece out there that failed last year that is back this year that would make it single subject, which I think most people absolutely agree with that. If you remember the one amendment that was offshore drilling and indoor vaping, as I call it, the peanut butter and jelly of constitutional ballot amendments, were together as, I think, ballot number 7. Why was that together? I have no idea. So the single subject might be something that they can pass. With that is what was failed last year and come back. Here's a quick sneak preview. We're in the midst of committee weeks right now. We already had one a couple weeks ago. Chris and I and the team will be in Tallahassee again next week and the week following for weeks 2 and 3 of committee weeks. They take a short week break so we can go home and have fun at Halloween, and then they're back those 2 weeks in November before Thanksgiving and once in December. And then on January 14th through 13th, they have the regular session, as you see up there as well. The governor is constitutionally required to have his budget recommendation in by December 13th. 30 days before the legislative session. Now, when we sent this in to y'all at that time, there were only 163 bills filed. I just checked this morning. There's 508 bills filed. So things are moving fast. I'm sure they'll get to that 3,600 number before session starts. Of that 500, there's only about 90 appropriation bills, and the rest are policy or some resolutions. So things are moving up there quickly. You hear headlines now of this legislation filed or this governor priority that's coming down the line. So a lot is happening. And before we close for questions or what have you, I would say it's been a great honor of this firm to represent this group in Tallahassee for many years now. It might almost be a decade now. Had a lot of fun fights to protect your right to pool your insurance and to have savings, and we've worked with Hasib, Shane, and the gang to expand some of those options so that you guys can continue to diversify your portfolio here at the Florida Insurance Trust so that you continue to be competitive and offer savings for your members. So we're excited to do that. Every year we appreciate being a part of the team and working on your behalf. It's a lot of fun, and you guys are good folks. So with that, questions? Anything we could do? I got my phone a friend with Kim here, so really ask the hard ones because I'm going to give them to her. Yep. Sorta. So anyone from Broward County here? Okay, yeah. So you know about that. Okay. So if you recall, outside of Broward's inability to count votes, I'm just kidding. They have a sheriff that was suspended by the governor, Scott Israel, and so. In many ways, it was tied to what happened with Parkland, but in other ways, it was just a more global issues. And the governor decided to use his executive powers to suspend him. The sheriff's rights in this due process is that he can ask for a hearing before the Senate, and the Senate can either approve the suspension and he'll be removed from office or not. The governor did this with two constitutional officers, a superintendent and the Panhandle. The superintendent in the governor's office ultimately worked out a resolution where she was reinstated for a day so she could retire, keep her benefits, and move on. Scott Israel, the sheriff, the now suspended sheriff from Broward, has chose to go the route of he's going to fight for his rights and go through the Senate. It's interesting. There was the special master for the Senate, which is for another way of saying the judge for the Senate on this case, ruled in favor of the sheriff. And so now the Senate will have a special session. Is it this coming week or it's next?
Next week.
Next one. So in 2 weeks, if you will, they will have a special session through the Senate to take this up. There'll be discussion, debate, testimony, and ultimately a decision made. So this is a tough spot for the Senate. I would not envy President Galvano. You have a special master that said, yeah, the governor shouldn't have done it, reinstate the sheriff. Oh, but, the governor has veto authority and and you want to have a good relationship there. And the governor has doubled down. He says, nope, I think he should be absolutely kicked out of office. I want him out. If you were if you were living on a rock, you don't know this, but everyone else it's a Republican majority in the Senate. It's a slim Republican majority, but it's a Republican majority. My gut is they go the way of the governor, but I haven't been counting noses on this. I've had a couple casual conversations, so I really don't have a lot of knowledge. But yes, this will be something that might actually get some national attention because they're going to tie it to Parkland. So you heard it here first in 2 weeks. That'll be fun. Or not. Other questions? Well, folks, keep doing what you're doing. Be sure to be nice to Kim here if you weren't already. Again, it's a pleasure to work with you all. You guys do amazing things, and we always love bragging about y'all to the legislators when they come here to speak with you and when you guys come to Tallahassee. And of course, if any of you guys are going to be in Tallahassee during session, whether you have other lobbyists or not, feel free to give us, Hasib and Shane can give you our numbers. We'd love to catch up with you and hear how things are going back in your neck of the woods.